Welcome back, deep divers. Today we're taking a trip back in time to the 14th century to meet a ruler who's been captivating imaginations for, well, centuries.
Mansa
Musa, the ruler of the Mali Empire, and maybe, just maybe, the wealthiest person to ever walk the earth.
That's the big question, isn't it? The sources we have are, well, they're a bit of a mixed bag.
Mixed bag.
Yeah. We've got accounts from Arab scholars who, actually met Musa. And then we've got these fascinating oral traditions passed down through generations by the Mandinka people themselves.
So, like, different sides of the same coin.
Exactly. And sometimes those sides don't quite match up, which makes our deep dive all the more interesting.
I like where this is going already.
Yeah.
Okay, so before we get into the gold and the glory, set the stage for us. What was the Mali Empire like during Mansa Musa's reign?
Okay, picture this. 14th century West Africa. The Mali Empire is at its peak, stretching across a huge territory. And they control something vital.
The gold mines.
The gold mines, yes. But also the salt trade routes. This control of resources, well, it basically fueled the empire's power and naturally Mansa Musa's wealth.
So it wasn't just about having lots of gold. It was about controlling, like, the supply chain.
Exactly. Smart, right. But then we have these oral traditions preserved by the Jili or, the griots. They were like the historians, the storytellers, the keepers of Mandinka history. And their view of Musa, well, it's a little different.
Different how?
They're less interested in, the bling. They're more focused on his relationship with Mandinka traditions, Some of those traditions, well, they saw Musa as someone who might have strayed a little too far from them.
Straying? Like, he wasn't traditional enough?
Let's just say he was really open to embracing customs from the wider Islamic world. Maybe a little too open for some people's liking.
That's interesting. It kind of makes you wonder if some folks saw him as, like, an outsider. Even though he was the ruler, is that maybe connected to the whole debate about his lineage, too?
Could be. Whether he was a direct descendant of Sundiata Keita, the founder of the Mali Empire, that's a question that still keeps historians up at night.
Up at night, really?
Oh, yeah. Some sources say he came to power through a different branch of the family. Imagine the political drama, right?
It's like a 14th century soap opera.
Uh-huh.
Okay, but let's get to the event that really put Mansa Musa on the world map. His pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324. Now, we've all heard about the gold, right? But was it all just a big show of wealth, or was there more to it?
Oh, it was a spectacle, for sure. No doubt about that.
So, like, just showing off?
Well, not so fast. Imagine this. An entourage of, over 12,000 people, slaves carrying gold bars, camels loaded with enough supplies for months. But we also have to remember what it meant to be a Muslim ruler back then.
What do you mean?
Piety. Generosity. These were big deals, showing your devotion. Well, that was essential for any ruler who wanted to be taken seriously in the Islamic world.
So it wasn't just about the bling. It was about, like, solidifying his reputation.
Bingo. This was way before social media, right? A ruler's rep spread through travelers and scholars. So this pilgrimage, it was like a massive PR campaign.
I never thought of it that way. And speaking of strategy, you mentioned that Musa, he controlled the gold trade, right?
Yeah.
Could all this extravagant spending have been a clever way to, inflate the value of Malian gold?
Ooh, that's a good question. Historians still debate this, Some argue all that gold giving, it actually caused economic hiccups in places like Egypt. Like, Musa flooded the market with gold, and that devalued it.
Wow, a gold rush gone wrong.
Others say the impact was pretty localized, short-lived, but it definitely got people talking.
That's for sure. So maybe it did work in his favor, back home in Mali at least.
Mm-hmm.
But even with all that wealth, there are stories that he ran into some problems on his way back from Mecca.
Yeah, the return trip, it wasn't quite as smooth. There were hardships, People died, supplies ran low. And get this.
What?
There are accounts that Musa actually had to borrow money.
No way. The richest man in the world had to borrow money? That's kind of funny. And also kind of human.
Totally. Even the most powerful people, right? They hit bumps in the road. It's easy to forget that when we only focus on the big, epic stories.
That's so true. Okay, so he eventually makes it back to Mali. I'm guessing with some wild stories and maybe a souvenir or two. What did he do with all those experiences when he got home?
Ambitious building projects. Think magnificent mosques, madrasas, which are Islamic schools, especially in cities like Timbuktu and Gao. But these projects, they weren't just about religion. They were savvy investments.
Investments in what?
Mali's future, building mosques, it attracted scholars, students, and that boosted trade and cultural exchange.
So like making Timbuktu a cultural hub.
Exactly. He transformed the city into this vibrant center of learning and commerce, and that's no small feat.
Mansa Musa, the city planner. But Timbuktu, it also faced some threats during his rule, right? Wasn't there an invasion or something?
Oh, yeah. The Mossi kingdom, a powerful neighbor, they did manage to capture Timbuktu for a while. But Musa, he wasn't going to let that stand. He retook the city, built up its defenses, stationed troops.
So he wasn't just a builder and scholar. He was a warrior king, too. We've got this image of him now. Devout Muslim, extravagant spender, strategic builder, and decisive military leader. But I keep thinking about what you said earlier, about those different perspectives from the Arab writers and the Mandinka griots. It's like those conflicting stories about him, maybe they tell us something deeper, something about the man himself.
That's a really interesting point. I think we're just scratching the surface of Mansa Musa's story. There's definitely more to uncover.
It's like we can't just accept that whole richest man who ever lived thing, right?
Yeah.
Maybe that was part of his plan all along, to build this, like, mythical image of himself.
It's definitely possible. Don't forget, a lot of those early accounts about his wealth, well, they were based on like estimations and secondhand stories. It's tough to really compare wealth across different time periods, you know?
Okay, so we should be a little skeptical of that richest man ever title. But that still doesn't explain the different views we get from those Arab writers and the Mandinka griots. One side is all praise for his generosity and piety. The other sees him as someone who turned his back on tradition. How do we make sense of that?
Well, we got to consider who's telling the story, right? The Arab scholars, they were often impressed by how much Musa followed Islamic principles and all that charity. Well, that fit right in with their own values.
But for the griots, their job was to protect those Mandinka traditions. So Musa embracing foreign customs, that could have seemed like a threat, like he was choosing sides almost.
Exactly. He was caught in the middle, you know, trying to balance faith, culture, power. Think about it. He brings back these ceremonial objects from Mecca, these baleo, and starts incorporating them into Mandinka rituals. He's trying to blend things, but not everyone's happy about it.
So he wasn't just saying forget that old stuff. He was trying for, like, a fusion. That's pretty interesting. But wouldn't that cause some tension?
For sure. And we see that tension in the historical records. It's a reminder that even when you do something that seems good, there can be unexpected consequences, you know, especially when it comes to things like cultural identity.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's like we're watching those early clashes between global and local playing out centuries ago. But let's get back to Musa's rule in Mali. He expands the empire, builds those mosques and schools. But what about, like, his actual leadership style? Was he a hands-on kind of guy?
From what we know, he was pretty involved in running things. We hear about him setting up a system of provinces, appointing governors. Sounds like he had a pretty organized system.
Yeah, that makes sense. An empire that big, you'd need strong leadership, right? But he also seemed to get the importance of knowledge. Was that just for religious reasons, or did he see education as a way to make Mali stronger?
I think it was both. He was a devout Muslim, no doubt, but he also got the practical side of education, investing in those schools, bringing scholars to Timbuktu. He was creating a center of learning, something that would make Mali more influential.
Like, he realized that knowledge is power, not just in a spiritual way, but for the economy, politics, even the military.
Exactly. By encouraging learning, he was setting Mali up for success down the line. It wasn't just about him being a good Muslim. It was about securing his legacy and the future of his empire.
So maybe Mansa Musa's greatest legacy wasn't his wealth, but the fact that he understood that you got to invest in education, in infrastructure, if you want long-term success.
That's a great way to put it. His reign shows how a leader can use resources, the physical ones and the intellectual ones, to build a really thriving society.
We've covered a lot of ground here. We talked about his crazy journey to Mecca, his complicated relationship with tradition, his smart approach to leadership.
Yeah.
But I still keep coming back to those conflicting stories about him. Was he a good guy, or was he playing everyone?
Yeah.
How do we square those different versions of him?
Well, you got to remember, people are complicated, right? Especially historical figures. Mansa Musa was a product of his time. He had good qualities and he had flaws. That's just how it is.
So we can't just label him a hero or a villain.
Nope. It's those contradictions that make him so interesting to study.
I have to say, this whole deep dive, it's really changed how I think about Mansa Musa. I started off thinking, richest dude ever. Now I see someone much more interesting. someone who understood image, education, and how hard it is to balance old and new.
And that's what's so cool about studying history. It's not about easy answers or judging people from the past. It's about understanding the whole picture, seeing things from different angles, and accepting that there's always more to the story.
There's a lesson in there for all of us, don't you think?
Definitely. Especially these days when we're constantly bombarded with info from every direction. It's more important than ever to think critically, question what we hear, and remember that there's always more than one side to every story.
That's something to think about. So as we wrap up our deep dive into Mansa Musa, what's the one thing you hope our listener takes away from all this?
You know, it gets me. I think it's easy to get caught up in, the gold and the grandeur. But for me, what really stands out is, it's a human story, isn't it? Mansa Musa. He was ambitious, he had his faith, and he really wanted to leave his mark on the world.
Yeah, totally. And his story, it still speaks to us, Globalization, cultural exchange, power dynamics, all that stuff. We're still wrestling with those same issues today.
It's like Mansa Musa's reign, it's like a case study, almost. So to anyone listening out there, what does your deep dive into Mansa Musa tell you? What surprised you? What are you still thinking about?
We've looked at the historical accounts, right? The economics, the architecture, even that funny story about him having to borrow money. But there's always more to discover. It's funny, we tend to fixate on the big stories of history. The kings, the battles, empires rising and falling. But what about the regular people? Like, what was it like to be a merchant in Timbuktu during its heyday? Or a student at that Sankora madrasa?
Ooh, yeah. Or imagine the stories those travelers brought back from Mecca. What did they tell their families? How did seeing all that change their worldview?
We might never have all the answers, but just the fact that we're still asking these questions after all this time, that says a lot about the power of Mansa Musa's story. It reminds us that history, it's not just facts and dates. It's made up of people's lives.
And it's a story that keeps evolving, right? As we find new evidence, new ways of looking at things, that's what makes history so cool. It's an ongoing adventure.
So keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep into the past. You never know what you might find.
And until next time, stay curious, folks.